My name is LoraKim Joyner. I was all over the place on the conference yesterday. I'm co-director with One Earth Conservation and work with so many people. And it's my great privilege today to be able to facilitate this panel. I currently live in Des Moines, Iowa. It is the home of where the Iowa people lived, of many peoples and beings in the Carolina parakeet, who is now extinct. This panel is going to be discussing the impact of harm to the environment, to ecosystem, and the harm there impacts parrots, and then how the harm to parrots impacts the ecosystems. And we'll be talking about free-flying parrots in one flock, no matter where they are, how whether they're in dusty cages along the side of a road, outside of their normal range, or flying free. And as you've seen, that all of these harms are interconnected, and the parrots need a healthy ecosystem, and a healthy ecosystem needs the parrots. This challenge to our ecosystems is huge, and we are in a crisis. We all hear about the climate change, and it hurts so many. It hurts parrots. We are seeing this harm all over the world, and we don't really know all the impacts of the climate change and the extra stresses it's already causing in a vulnerable group of birds, the parrots, whose populations, 50% of these populations are in decline. Our parrots are at a risk and in crisis, and so are our ecosystems, our health, and the fragmentation of our ecosystems. In Guatemala and Honduras, we're having tremendous forest loss. And about a study that just came out recently said about 20% of that forest loss is due to the traffic of cocaine through the forest. Recreational drugs in other countries is driving habitat loss and parrot loss and endangering people's lives, such as we heard from Hector, and it's hurting people and it's hurting the conservationists. That connections are profuse, and it's hard to protect parrots and habitat. Some of the other things that happens to ecosystems is the dangerous criminal elements. How can we protect habitats? Hector was telling us about this. Political instability, corruption, ingrained systems of domination and colonialism, and extractive economies by taking things out. How can we protect our ecosystems or our parrots? We are learning how unsanctioned gold mining is hurting Guyana and Suriname, and mining and logging, legal and illegal, is taking out habitat, and then it puts in access roads so people and wildlife traffickers and hunters can come in and then put the wildlife at risk. And we all take part in precious metals and our phones and jewelry, and so we're all part of this chain of harm for our parrots. Parrots need stable societies, they need stable climates, they need abundant trees and food, and so do we. What hurts one of us hurts all of us, and parrots help us see the interconnections, and that way they're a keystone species in our understanding, in growing, as Lori says, our entangled empathy. These harms are interwoven in the bedrock of our communities and extremely difficult to manage. But that's why we're here. We need each other. And the first steps are awareness of the tragedy and the beauty. And with that, we need good science. And that's where David and Katherine, the second and third panelists, are going to bring us the science to talk about how parrots are interwoven with ecosystems. We also need social analysis and investigation into the human dimensions of conservation, which Lisa, our first panelist, is going to be talking about. And then our final panelist for the day is going to have sort of an overarching view, and that's Pat, and he's going to talk about the results of the parrot trade and all the interconnecting harms that come together in the phenomenon of parrots living in urban areas. All of them are going to show that parrots exist as a very poignant species to show us the way of what we need to change and how to do it. By working with parrots, we not only save them, but the planet and ourselves. That's my kind of introducing this great panel. They're all doctors and they all do great things. And we're going to begin with Lisa. Lisa Paravisini-Gebert is a professor of Caribbean culture and literature in the Department of Hispanic Studies and the Environmental Study programs at Vassar College, where she holds, oh boy, the Distinguished Professor Chair. Sarah Todd Fitz. She knows people and she knows parrots, and she's going to help us make those connections. Lisa, please, I would enjoy hearing from you now.
Thank you so much. Okay, great. Thank you so much. In the Caribbean archipelago, the fear of anyone working to protect local parrots is that climate change, manifested through rapidly warming air temperatures, declining food availability, and the intensification of extreme weather events, may signal the end of parrot species that have lived in the region for millions of years. The region is not unfamiliar with extinctions, as only 10 of as many as 20 to 25 species recorded in the first centuries after their European encounter remain. New World parrots took center stage in the first exchange between Europeans and the native peoples of the region in 1492, as one of the salient items offered in that historic first barter. Native inhabitants were known to have kept parrots as pets, but this first exchange would change the scale of species trades in the region forever, endangering numerous parrot species in the process. Thousands were given away to European kings as tokens of Spain's feat of discovery, becoming emblems of the marvels of the newly discovered Caribbean territories. The steady decline of the Caribbean's Amazona populations can be measured from the first century of the colonization process, caused by widespread deforestation to open millions of acres for sugar production, cattle raising, logging, the introduction of parrot predators, and poaching to supply Europe's growing exotic pet market. The Caribbean parrot's need for reasonably large expanses of forest made them particularly vulnerable to the type of ecological revolution unleashed by European colonizers. The threats brought by climate change now exacerbate earlier impacts, leading some experts to conclude that the region's parrots are doomed in the wild. The impact of climate change on Caribbean avian populations can be measured already through changes in population distribution, increased temperatures on breeding grounds, and changes in rainfall that affect patterns of migration. But by far the greatest menace comes from the increases in hurricane intensity, in their frequency, size, duration, levels of rainfall, and wind speeds that scientists predict as global temperatures shift upwards. Parrot species are especially vulnerable to hurricane damage because they are dependent on forests and their thick vegetation for food and protection. As storms strip their forest habitats bare, surviving the hurricane is only the first step, as they must then face limited food supplies, often competing with predators for food and shelter. This was the case with the damage inflicted by Hurricane David on Dominica in 1979, when the populations of the island's two endemic parrots, the Cicero, the Amazona imperialis, and the Jaco, the Amazona arausiaca, already endangered, saw their numbers reduced to catastrophically low levels, prompting the Forestry Service to launch a highly successful project to bring them out of the IUCN's endangered list. Puerto Rico's population, endemic species, the Amazona vittata, with a wild population of about 2,000 in the 1930s, sustained a serious population decline that reduced it to 47 individuals by 1975. The impact of Hurricane Hugo in 1989 brought that number down to a critically endangered low of 22 birds. A number impacted negatively again in 1998 by Hurricane George. Before the rainforest at El Yunque, the last stronghold of its relict wild population, sustained a direct hit from Hurricane Maria in September 2017, the number of individuals in the wild population stood at 13. Tom White, the chief biologist of the Puerto Rican Parrot Recovery Program, feared that the fragile remaining population, a tiny group he described as being on life support, could not survive another hurricane. Sadly, the critically endangered parrot populations of Puerto Rico and Dominica were the hardest hit by Hurricanes Irma and Maria. In July 2017, Steve Durant of Dominica's Forestry Division cautioned that despite the Cicero and Jacko's slow but steady recovery, which had brought the species back to numbers close to 5 times their pre-Hurricane David population, at that time 250 to 350 for the Cicero, 1,200 to 1,500 for the Jacko. Climate change, with its potential for intensive hurricanes, made both species' future far from secure. In 2017, the Cicero, the largest of the Caribbean Amazona parrots, a remarkably beautiful bird that features on the island's flag and coat of arms, sustained heavy losses following the obliteration of its mountain canopy habitat by Hurricane Maria. Shy and elusive, no specimens were sighted for nearly 6 weeks after the hurricane, despite television and radio appeals, and it was feared that it had been driven to extinction. There is still uncertainty about the current population size, which estimates place at between 40 and 50 mature individuals, a terribly disheartening predicament for the dedicated forestry officers who have worked on their protection for 4 decades. The Puerto Rican parrot is listed by the IUCN as one of the 10 most vulnerable birds in the world. 2 subspecies have already gone extinct, including the Amazona vittata gracilipes, lost to deforestation, hunting, and a devastating 1899 hurricane known as San Ciriaco. Before Hurricane Maria struck, the 13 parrots left in its extant wild population lived in a range of a little over 6 square miles. That is 0.2% of its pre-colonial range, an area increasingly encroached by tourism and vacation homes. These developments had not only restricted the wild population to its smallest range and lowest numbers ever, but had increased the presence of its natural predators, particularly the red-tailed hawk, pushed away from its own habitat by continued construction of hotels and shopping malls into the parrot's range. El Yunque National Forest is under the aegis of the U.S. National Forest. Sorry, I cannot move my slides for some reason. El Yunque National Forest is under the aegis of the U.S. National Park Service. In the 1990s, the Puerto Rican Forestry Commission received half of their captive population, around 80 birds born in captivity, to set up a new breeding aviary. This aviary, where Puerto Rican scientists have continued to breed parrots in close cooperation with the U.S. team at El Yunque, is in the island karst area, the largest contiguously forested area on the island. When Hurricanes Irma and Maria swept through Puerto Rico in 2017, some 140 recently released Puerto Rican parrots were living and breeding in the wild in the karst forest. They fared relatively well after the Hurricane Maria, despite moderate damage to that forest, with a survival rate of about 73%. This new population, born and bred in captivity, is, however, creating its own culture and language without access to the extant wild population in El Yunque, the only population that used the characteristic vocalizations that marked the culture of the Puerto Rican parrot at the time when the species began to be studied by scientists. The wild population in El Yunque, alas, did not fare well in the wake of Hurricanes Irma and Maria, their habitat having sustained a direct hit. Before the storms, White and his U.S. forestry team had planned the capture and re-release in the karst region of one of their wild breeding pairs, hoping that they could breed again in their new habitat and teach their own young the vocalizations threatened with extinction, thereby preserving a cultural component of the parrot's development in the wild. But this was not meant to be. The wild flock of parrots at El Yunque, as well as a flock of released captive-bred individuals, could not be readily located after the storm. The flock of El Yunque has been slowly replenished with a handful of survivors and with the release of the captive-bred population that survived the storm under special protection in the aviary. How then do we address the Caribbean parrot's increased vulnerability to climate change and its concomitant extreme weather events? The carbon emissions responsible for warming temperatures in the Caribbean are outside local control, as the Caribbean islands' contribution to global warming has been negligible. We must therefore continue to conserve and restore key habitats and expand protected areas. This should include protecting habitats at higher elevations, if possible, to account for future climate shifts. More should be done to reduce other threats, such as the capture of birds for the pet trade and continued hunting, sometimes for gourmet soup making. The promotion of ecotourism and education about the importance of protecting parrots should continue to be priorities. These strategies have been instrumental in protecting all parrot species in the Caribbean, most particularly our two critically endangered species, and we hope they continue to do so for years to come. Crucial to these efforts are the incredibly dedicated scientists and forestry officials across the region who deserve our heartfelt gratitude. Thank you.
Thank you for helping us make the connections of the trade, colonialism, climate change, consumerism, and applauding so many of the many great conservationists. Thank you, Lisa. We'll come back to you. Panel, yeah. So we're going to continue learning about parrots and the environment. We're now going to listen to David Vergara-Tabares, and his research is really kind of at the big scale of the mutualistic interactions, how plants and can help vertebrates and birds, and how it affects forest dynamics. And he's looked at this particularly with seed dispersers and with parrots, and he's going to tell you all about that. And he's going to show us that why we need parrots, why the ecosystems do, and maybe how parrots can serve as ambassadors to save forests and to save other species. And David, you're up, and I sure hope your internet's going to work for you.
Okay, thank you. Bueno, les voy a hablar en español, castellano. Las dos ideas centrales que quiero transmitir en mi presentación es acerca de los efectos que tienen los loros sobre las dinámicas de las comunidades naturales y los ecosistemas. Y por otro lado, cómo los loros responden a los cambios ambientales, principalmente cambios generados por la humanidad. Y cómo esas dos ideas pueden contribuir a la protección tanto de los loros en sí mismos, sino también a la trama de la vida en general. Entonces, bueno, en primer lugar voy a hablar de los efectos de los loros sobre las dinámicas de las comunidades vegetales a través, como para introducirnos en la generalidad de lo que es la dispersión de semillas. En esta imagen podemos ver un esquema acerca de cómo es el proceso de dispersión de semillas y a qué presiones están sujetas las semillas en este camino hacia generar un nuevo individuo. Los loros principalmente están involucrados en el consumo de frutos y cómo estos llevan a las semillas lejos de las plantas madres, lo cual puede beneficiar a la especie vegetal particular. Pero bueno, no todo es tan simple. Este mutualismo que existe entre las plantas y los loros o los animales en general que llevan a las semillas lejos de las plantas madres, ocurre en un gradiente. Por ejemplo, tenemos animales que son granívoros, los cuales al consumir las frutas o las semillas destruyen a los embriones. En este caso estamos frente a una interacción antagonista. Por el otro lado tenemos a los frugívoros. Aquí tenemos ilustrados a un paseriforme y a los monos, los cuales se alimentan de fruto y la semilla es dispersada, ya sea a través de las heces o las regurgitaciones, y esta semilla permanece intacta para luego poder germinar. Estamos aquí frente a un caso de un mutualismo. Sin embargo, existe un gradiente entre este mutualismo y antagonismo, y los loros pueden estar en cualquier parte de este gradiente. De hecho, los loros son comúnmente conocidos por ser animales que destruyen a las semillas con su fuerte pico. Pero bueno, ahora les voy a mostrar algunos casos de investigaciones que se realizaron en el Neotrópico que muestran que no siempre los loros son depredadores de semillas. Bueno, esto es parte de un programa de investigación que no lo desarrollo yo, sino que otros colegas liderados por José Tella y Guillermo Blanco, donde trabajaron en varios lugares del Neotrópico, focalizando en las interacciones frugívoras que ocurren entre loros y plantas que son dispersadas por animales. Entonces, bueno, observaron que muchas especies, las cuales habitaron en una zona de la selva seca de Bolivia, contribuyen diferencialmente al éxito o a la dispersión de muchas especies vegetales. En este grafiquito, por ejemplo, podemos ver cada barra representa una especie de loro particular eh, y los diferentes colores representan algún tipo de interacción particular, ¿no? Tenemos negro la polinización, en rojo la dispersión y en verde la facilitación, si se quiere, por ejemplo, al picar algún fruto, dejarlo disponible para que otros animales lo dispersen a larga distancia. Aquí podemos ver que no todas las especies de loro eh, tienen una función idéntica, sino que entre todos se complementan para interactuar con un diferente número de especies. Por ejemplo, en el eje Y tenemos el número de plantas, número de especies de plantas con las cuales interactúa cada especie de loro. Podemos ver que eh, en, en total las especies de loro se complementarían en su función ecológica. Bueno, en esta otra diapositiva se destaca un rol muy importante de los loros, que es la dispersión de semillas a larga distancia. Una de las características, si se quiere, paradigmáticas o particulares de los loros es que se mueven a grandes distancias. Entonces aquí podemos ver en estos recuadros a la izquierda inferiores tres especies de guacamayos eh, los cuales consumen y dispersan semillas a largas distancias. Aquí podemos ver puntitos donde encontraron semillas a una distancia X de las plantas focales o madres. Esto tiene particular relevancia en aquellos ambientes fragmentados. Entonces, la presencia de loros en estos ambientes es crítica para la regeneración o la sucesión secundaria de estos ambientes boscosos. Otras observaciones particulares que he hecho en mi sistema de estudio en el centro de Argentina es que los loros, en su rol como depredador de semillas, pueden contribuir a controlar especies invasoras. Por ejemplo, eh, la cotorra argentina es un excelente predador de semillas de estas plantas rosáceas que son un problema tremendo en el centro de Argentina. Bueno, ahora como para cambiar el foco, ya les conté acerca de los efectos de los loros ecosistémicos y ahora les quiero hablar sobre un trabajo que hicimos con varios colegas, tanto de Argentina como de Australia, donde evaluamos cómo los cambios globales a través de la deforestación y la tala selectiva pueden afectar la conservación de los loros. Este trabajo fue hecho a escala global. En esta imagen quiero mostrar cómo los cambios del uso de la tierra eh, est están distribuidos heterogéneamente en el globo. Podemos ver que tanto en Sudamérica como en Australasia se está dando actualmente un cambio muy abrupto del uso de la tierra. Eh, por ejemplo, en el hemisferio norte estamos viendo que eh, los programas de reforestación, etcétera, están cambiando lo que anteriormente se dio en 1800, por ejemplo, que fue la pérdida de bosque, mientras que ahora eso se está revirtiendo. Bueno, como sabemos, los loros tienen una distribución pantropical y habitan principalmente en bosques. Tal es así que el 70% de las especies son dependientes de bosques. Esto es muy importante. Nosotros elegimos los loros para evaluar cómo los cambios en los bosques eh, pueden afectar la conservación de las especies, ya que los loros son, históricamente han sido muy utilizados como mascotas, están asociados actualmente a un gran mercado, ya sea ilegal o legal, tienen, representan una gran eh, preocupación internacional, por lo cual pueden ser utilizados como especies bandera, si se quiere, o paraguas para conservar aquellos hábitats a los cuales estas especies utilizan y tienen requerimientos específicos. Y bueno, también para discutir un poco también cómo las áreas protegidas están distribuidas en el planeta, la mayoría de nosotros sabemos que están distribuidas en regiones de bajo económico valor o que tienen una belleza escénica particular o son inaccesibles. Y en general los vertebrados tienen poca representación en estas áreas protegidas. Por lo tanto, surge la pregunta de cómo los loros están representados en estas áreas protegidas. Más o menos ya lo dije anteriormente, pero el objetivo principal de nuestro trabajo fue evaluar cómo los cambios espaciotemporales, o sea, a lo largo del tiempo y a lo largo del globo, de la degradación del hábitat y el pérdida de bosque, afecta al riesgo de extinción de los loros. Nosotros nos basamos en información ya existente de BirdLife, principalmente descargamos los polígonos de distribución de cada una de las especies para luego solaparlos y desarrollar un mapa de puntos calientes de distribución, de riqueza de especies de loros en función también de su tendencia poblacional y estatus de conservación en la UNC-CONICET. Descargamos varios mapas de pérdida de bosque a escala global en un lapso de tiempo que va desde el año 2000 con predicciones para el 2050. Cualquiera de estos detalles metodológicos, después me pueden preguntar en privado o en el panel de preguntas que sigue a continuación. Pero ahora ya para ir a los resultados, en estos mapas mostramos las principales regiones del planeta con presencia de loros. A modo de ejemplo, aquí tenemos en el año 2000 en Sudamérica la cuenca del Amazonas con mayor riqueza de loros y prácticamente con poca pérdida de hábitat. Y podemos ver que a medida que transcurren los años, eh, esta pérdida de hábitat se va a ir acercando a esas zonas de alta riqueza. Y eso básicamente ocurre en prácticamente todos los continentes. Este es un foco más o menos para que vean lo que ocurre en Sudamérica. Y aquí en rojo le sumamos una capa de extracción de madera, lo cual es interesante destacar, ya que los loros, al depender principalmente de árboles viejos para reproducirse, podría ser también una amenaza para su conservación. Podemos ver que en Sudamérica, en la zona de alta diversidad, de alta riqueza de loros, esto puede ser un problema. Y también en el panel derecho superior podemos ver que en Indonesia también esto podría ser un grave problema. No se asusten con este gráfico, lo cuento rápidamente para ir cerrando la charla. Podemos ver que cada uno de estos círculos en el gráfico derecho está representada una especie. Eh, los círculos periféricos representan un umbral que representa un estado de conservación, es decir, las especies que están contenidas en el círculo más pequeño se encuentran categorizadas como en peligro de extinción, las que siguen vulnerables y las que siguen casi amenazadas. En el futuro podremos ver que algunas de estas especies que tienen un color distinto, no se ve bien acá en la diapositiva, van a pasar a un estado de conservación, a una categoría de conservación más crítica, dada su pérdida de hábitat. En el artículo se puede ver particularmente, que lo puedo compartir con quien lo necesite, cuáles son las especies en particulares para las cuales se predice que van a cambiar de estado de conservación a un estado de conservación más crítico. Aquí, por ejemplo, tenemos el caso para las especies neotropicales. Todas estas especies que están ilustradas son aquellas especies que pasarían a un estatus de conservación peor. Y bueno, como para cerrar, aquí tenemos básicamente un mensaje positivo y un mensaje negativo. El positivo es que los dos principales hotspots o puntos calientes de riqueza van a estar relativamente conservados frente a la pérdida de hábitat, mientras que la zona de los Andes amazónicos de Colombia y Venezuela y el sudeste de Australia van a estar comprometidos en el futuro debido a la pérdida de hábitat. Y los otros dos hotspots, si bien no van a sufrir grandes modificaciones de hábitat, la presión sobre la extracción de madera va a ser alta, lo cual es una especie de alerta para el futuro de las especies que allí habitan. Bueno, aquí como para ilustrar un poco, la isla de Papúa Nueva Guinea tiene muchísimas especies que están categorizadas como eh, en preocupación menor. Sin embargo, según nuestros mapas, podemos decir que están sufriendo ciertas amenazas, lo cual debería recibir mayor atención y programar futuros monitoreos de las poblaciones. Y bueno, para finalizar les dejo algunos mensajes generales eh, para que los lean. Y bueno, muchas gracias por su tiempo y por su atención.
Are you final words, David? Últimas palabras, David, ¿hay más?
Muchas gracias por su atención. No sé si se escuchó al final, pero a los mensajes los dejé como para que la gente los lea. Es un resumen de todo lo anterior. Así que muchas gracias.
Gracias, gracias, David. Fue fantástico. You scienced the heck out of that. That was really great. You showed us how parrots help ecosystems in so many ways and how they hurt them too. How awesome is ecology and evolution? And you showed us what the future could look like. So thank you so much for that. And we will now move on to our next speaker, Dr. Katherine Renton. She's a researcher at the Camela Biology Station at the National University in Mexico. She's been studying the ecology of parrots, threatened parrots in the dry tropical forest for a really long time, 25 years. I've been reading her articles forever. She sort of that's the goal on what we need to look for in the environment for what parrots need. She knows them and how they interact with wild systems. So thank you so much, Katherine, for being here.
Thank you. Well, I'd just like to talk a little bit about how parrots depend on conserved forests and are also an integral part of these tropical forests. So what do parrots need for their nest sites? Parrots depend on available tree holes, and they need to find a tree hole of sufficient size for the nest, but with characteristics that reduces the risk of predation. In terms of food resources, parrots consume resources of fruits, seeds, and flowers of plants that are highly variable. So parrots need to be able to track the variations and fluctuations in plant food resources. And parrots also can fly at long distances. They cover large areas and a variety of habitats, but they tend to be associated with conserved forests. So all of this makes parrots the most threatened avian family. They have the highest number and proportion of species at risk, but we know very little of the ecology and requirements of many species in the wild. So we've found that parrots are highly selective of the tree holes they use for nesting. And here we see a female parrot entering her nest. Parrots choose to nest in tree holes that are above 10 meters high in large old trees and that have a narrow entrance, just sufficient so that the parrot can enter the nest, and that are at least 1 meter deep inside. And this makes sense when we consider that the main cause of nest failure is predation. So by choosing to nest in a hole high up in a large tree with a narrow entrance and that's quite deep, they can reduce the access of predators to the nest and so increase the likelihood of successfully fledging their young. And the risk is not only for the nestlings. Here we see a male parrot entering the nest. The video's in slow motion so that we can see what is happening, because suddenly the parrot is attacked by a grey hawk. There's a struggle at the nest entrance, but the hawk can't get inside the nest because the entrance is too narrow and the nest is also over 1 meter deep inside. So the parrot managed to escape from the hawk, and this nesting pair were successful and they fledged 2 chicks from this nest. So in terms of food resources, parrots consume mainly the fruits and seeds of plants, and they have varied diets. Studies of 112 parrot species found that each species of parrot uses, on average, 18.5 plant species in the diet. And parrots are also highly adaptable in their diets. They can quickly switch between plant species and between habitats, and this enables them to closely track fluctuations in plant food resources. So because parrots consume seeds, they can be important seed predators, and we found that the lilac-crowned parrot is the main seed predator of the tree Astronium gravulans. We can see here that parrots directly consumed 47% of the seeds in the tree, and they also discarded 13% of immature seeds below the tree that are unlikely to germinate. So there's a total loss of 60% of the seeds of the tree due to foraging by parrots. But about 20% of the fruits do escape this predation and are able to germinate. So by consuming a large number of seeds, parrots prevent any one tree species from becoming too dominant, and so they help to maintain diversity of tree species in the forest. However, parrot populations, all parrot populations in the wild are declining, and we know almost nothing of how this might impact the dynamics of tropical forests. So birds select specific habitats also for essential life history processes such as reproduction. And in the case of parrots, they require conserved old growth forests where they can find nest sites and that provide the resources, the food resources they need during the breeding season. So in the case of this pair of lilac-crowned parrots, they obtained their nest site. They incubated their eggs for over a month, and then they spent 2 months raising their chicks. And the chick in the nest now is 2 months old and is about to fledge. So the fact that the nesting period takes 3 or 4 months for almost all species of parrot means that factors such as predation or changes in food resources can affect the success or failure of the nest. So the loss or degradation of these habitats has consequences for reproductive success of parrot populations in the wild. And we found in our long-term study of the lilac-crowned parrot that variations in rainfall between years affects all aspects of parrot reproduction, from the number of eggs they lay, the growth and survival of the young, the nestling diet, the reproductive success of nesting pairs, and the eventual recruitment of independent young in the population. And this is because rainfall influences the fruiting of trees and so the availability of food resources for parrots. So long-term climate change is likely to have consequences for reproduction of threatened parrot species. And we see this also in the increase in frequency and intensity of landfalling hurricanes. And our study site on the coast of Jalisco has been affected by 2 hurricanes. Recently, we had the minor Category 2 Hurricane Hoover in 2011, and the major Category 4 Hurricane Patricia in 2015. And both of these hurricanes had indirect effects on reproduction of lilac-crowned parrots in the forest. What we see here in the figure is the number of nests, nesting pairs each year, each breeding season, the average number of eggs laid, and the average number of chicks fledged from the nests. So parrots have low productivity. They lay about 2 or 3 eggs per female and fledge only about 1 or 2 nestlings per nesting pair. We can see in the case of both hurricanes that these had effects on their reproduction. In the case, in both cases, in the first year after hurricane impact, very few pairs nested, and those that did had low productivity. For the minor Hurricane Hoover, parrot nesting and productivity recovered by the second year. But in the case of the major Hurricane Patricia, although parrots continued nesting and laying eggs, they had very low productivity, fledging less than 1 chick per nesting pair. And almost a decade later, parrot reproduction has not recovered after Hurricane Patricia and continues to be the lowest that I've recorded for the species since starting the study in 1995. And finally, parrots have large area requirements. We radio tracked 68 lilac-crowned parrots and found that each parrot uses an area of about 8,900 hectares, which is practically the entire area of the Chmeloquixmala Biosphere Reserve here on the coast of Jalisco. Parrots also make long-distance migration and dispersal movements, and we found that parrots make a seasonal altitudinal migration from the reserve on the coast up into the mountains in May, June, which is the end of the dry season and is the period when there's a scarcity of food resources for parrots in the dry forests on the coast. So parrots spend 1 to 2 months in the migration site, and then they return to the reserve in July with the start of the rainy season. And juvenile parrots also make dispersal movements along the coast in October, November, when they separate from their family groups. And I've shown here 2 siblings that fledged from a nest in the reserve and dispersed in opposite directions when they became independent from their parents. So the fact that parrots make these long distance movements means that a single reserve isn't sufficient to maintain parrot populations, as they require alternate areas at critical times of the year. So we need to develop ecological connectivity among habitats and areas to permit movement of animal populations and so maintain functional ecosystems. So we've seen that parrots depend on large areas of conserved tropical forests where they can find suitable cavities for nesting, and that also enables them to track fluctuating plant food resources. And parrots have an important functional role in maintaining the diversity of tree species in tropical forests, and they require key habitats and areas for reproduction or at critical times of the year. But the loss or disturbance of these habitats has cascading long-term effects on threatened parrot species. Thank you.
Wow, you went way beyond. I didn't know you had done the hurricane work. I had not been tracking that and the climate change, and just really, really awesome to show us how important trees are and rainfall is and how it impacts parrots at so many levels. So thank you. Just really, I'm going to have to go back and study that talk. And we are about ready to get blown away by 4 out of 4 presenters, or 8 out of 8. They just keep coming. This is Dr. Pat Latas. She does everything. She does really great. She works with the wild parrots in Southern California. Her area of expertise, I want to say, is urban parrots the world over. And she serves on the Parrot Researchers Group. She's just leading the IUCN Wild Parrot Specialist Group, really organizing us at an international level. And I've heard her talk about urban parrots, and If you have socks on, it will blow them off. So thank you, Pat, for being here.
Well, thank you. I want to really express my gratitude for being part of such a absolutely magnificent summit. I feel very privileged to be here. So my topic actually needs an entire week conference. So I want you to grab onto your seats, hold on your hats, because we're going on a very quick trip to the city. So you might ask why I'm talking about city parrots when this is all about climate change and ecology and science and whatnot. Well, here's a couple questions you might consider. Why are there wild parrots in the city? And there's a lot of things that will impact parrots worldwide. What does it mean that there's wild parrots in cities to the future of wild parrots everywhere? So I'm going to do a very quick review of the whole network of everything all at once and every topic possible. There's humans, too many humans everywhere expanding. What that means is needs to be bigger cities and are part of incursion into agricultural areas and wildlands. That leads to ecosystem degradation. So many humans also means there needs to be bigger agriculture. Guess what? Again, incursion on natural lands and other less invasive agricultural practices, ecosystem degradation, and that works both ways in climate change. Worse ecology, system damage, worse climate change. The more incursion there is, the more ecosystem degradation there is, makes it easier for wildlife trade to happen. It just opens up areas for exploitation and extraction. And the more humans there are, the more they want exotic pets, and the more exotic pets they want, the more wildlife trade there is. So into all of this mix, we're going to add urban parrots. Ecosystem degradation can actually drive parrots, force them into cities, or take over their natural habitats, and what used to be wild parrots are now urban parrots. Climate change, same story. And wildlife trade works both ways. The more urban parrots there are, the more they can feed the wildlife trade. And the more wildlife trade there is, the more escapes and releases, and the more urban parrots could possibly result. So where exactly are all the birds that live in cities? Well, they're where you might think they are. They're in the areas where there's parrots, but also they're in places like Tokyo, New York, Chicago, Glasgow, Paris, Abu Dhabi, Rome, Miami. So here's our quiz for today. I want you to name the cities where these parrots occur, and I'll give you a hint. Only one of them is a native parrot. All the rest of them have been introduced. Okay, you've got 5 seconds. 5 seconds is up. And these are the cities where they live. The only native one here is in Brownsville, Texas, a red-crowned parrot. And here I have to give a huge shout out to one of our participants, Charles. Raise your hand or whatever, but Charles Alexander has been an amazing artist, photographer, writer, and naturalist studying these birds in the wild in a very busy urban area. So thank you, Charles. Thank you so much for letting me use that. Where are parrots exactly? Some of you recognize this little guy. And here's some places that monk parakeets live. Also these places as well. Blue-crowned parakeet, also known to many of you by the name blue-crowned conure, lives in a few cities as well. And it's interesting that these cities just happen to be large port cities for their countries. And the blue-crowned conure showed up after legal imports were no longer allowed in these countries. And our dear friend, the rose-ring parakeet, also known as Indian ringnecks, where do you think they live? And our little girl parakeet says these cities she likes pretty good, but oh my gosh, look, they're all over the world. They are everywhere. Why is that? Because they're the most popular pet that's traded both legally and illegally in the pet trade. Here's a beautiful, beautiful parrot. She lives in Germany. She's sitting in a native European tree, and she's eating berries that are about as toxic as anything you can imagine. And she and her friends and flock are flourishing. Germany, Stuttgart. And thank you again, Charles. This is the most beautiful and spectacular phenomenon. Red-crowned parrots in the cloudy skies of a deeply urban and vast human habitation along the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, USA. And these lovely parakeets, golden parakeets, are from an in situ breeding site with soft release into an urban park in a really large South American city. Parrots do pretty good in cities. They thrive. They just adapt and change and go along with the flow of the city beat. Now, why do parrots choose to live in cities? Well, some don't choose it at all. They've been there all along, and the city moved in on them. Some parrots are moving into the city because there's no resources left for them in their native lands. They just want a better life. And unfortunately, in cities where the urban parrots have been introduced, they were introduced by legal and illegal pet trade. That's where they came from. So, are they really illegal immigrants or what? No, red-crowned parrots are considered native species in Texas and protected as endangered species, and they came back to their native lands all on their own. Other parrots were captured, brought to foreign lands, and adapted, and now are thriving. And some species of parrots are natives. They just happen to get moved around the country and end up in the wrong positions. And really, urban parrots that are not native got there because of people. And a word about words. Words are really important. All these terms are applied to urban parrots, and it's very important to use the right terminology because governmental policy depends on that terminology, and the fate of thousands of parrots may depend on that terminology. So first things first, wild urban parrots are not feral animals. Feral animals are creatures that are domesticated by human beings, but they don't need us anymore, and they live without human supervision. Wild parrots in cities are many times native species, but they can be naturalized, non-native, and they can also be invasive species, but they are not feral. So are they aliens? A couple of these species have a lot of interactions with human policy, and it is proper terminology to call them alien introduced species. So yeah, sometimes they are aliens. Let's look at a couple of examples of city parrots. Yellow-headed Amazons, as you know them, yellow-headed parrots, are considered naturalized species in California, and they're afforded all the protections of native species in that state. They're non-native, naturalized, and are considered no threat to the native environment or flora and fauna. They're native in Belize, and they're endangered. Rainbow lorikeets are native to the eastern parts of Australia, but they've been introduced by, yes, the pet trade in the western parts of Australia. And now they are at such numbers that they're impacting in a very negative way the native parrot species in the western parts of Australia. So they have been deemed as invasive pests in Western Australia. So they're native invasive species. And then our dear friends, the rose-ringed parakeets, are pretty much considered invasive wherever they occur. And many countries just simply ignore them because they don't apparently be causing much harm. And other countries take very draconian effort to eradicate them. Well, again, parrots in cities do pretty good. And why is that? Because they're extremely adaptable many times. Rhodogeras chiriri, or the yellow chevron parakeet, is one of those. And all of these words and labels and conditions apply to them. On the good things about parrots in cities, they're really good neighbors most of the time. They're big, they're loud, they're colorful, they interact with people or ignore people. They get along quite well with other introduced species and native species, generally speaking, and they engage people in enjoying and understanding their urban wildlife. Unfortunately, if you have neighbors, sometimes they're very annoying. And parrots in the city can be very destructive. They like our shoddy architectural and cheap construction, make great nesting holes. They borrow fruit, they cause infrastructure damage, and the bin bandit cockatoo is the ecological equivalent of our North American and dearly beloved trash panda. Unfortunately, if there's annoying neighbors, sometimes they enter conflict. And some of the biggest complaints about the human parrot interaction are, do they harm native wildlife? Yes, they're noisy. And do they make us sick? But we also have to recognize that parrot-human conflicts go both ways. And do they make us sick? Well, don't know. There's only a few publications on this. I'd say we're data deficient, data suspect, costs a lot of money, so we may never really answer this question without a lot of investment. It'd be very easy to study, but very expensive. So I'm almost finished, LoraKim. Don't tell me I'm going over my time. I have a couple of propositions here to make. One, in Southern California, there's 14 species of naturalized parrots. 3 of them are endangered, and 2 of them probably have more birds than their native cousins in Mexico. There's other species in that group who are in deep trouble in their native lands. So let's consider this. Could cities be conservation refugia? Could we take these birds and think about safe and appropriate release sites for non-native, non-invasive, naturalized, and wild origin birds? For example, some of the confiscated parrots that are wild and need a place to go and can't return to their lands of origin. Just a thought to think about. So in wrapping up, how can cities help parrots? They can provide sanctuary to both common and rare species. And they act as a genetic savings account, just in case their wild cousins are extirpated. They also are developing genetic resilience to more and more people in the world and greater urbanization. How can parrots help cities? They can raise awareness of urban wildlife. They can raise awareness of the plight of parrots around the world. They can increase biodiversity in some very depauperate ecosystems. And I think probably most important and emotional and subjective is they're beautiful, they're big, they're loud, they fly free, and they're very engaging and capture people's imaginations. So I just want to say thank you. And don't forget, this really is a terrible crisis. Educate yourself, educate others, reach out. We're your family, interact with us. And thank you all of you, for doing the hard work that you do. Thank you.
You did it. You did it. You tied it all in together. The trade, the ecosystem, harm to parrots, harm to people, and you showed us that the harm, like other people on this panel, goes both ways. Parrots cause harm and are harmed. And so there's no unidirectional that who's the bad guys. We're all in it together. So thank you. Thank you so much.